So, hello, I'm Judith Hurwitz. I am the Chief Evangelist here at Geminos, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to introduce you to the CEO of Geminos, Stu Frost. And Stuart, I'm glad we can have this conversation. So, for those of you who don't know Stuart, he's been a star entrepreneur for many years. So, Stuart, let's start just a little bit about your journey and where you've been and what you started over the years.
Yeah, sure. It's been a long and winding road. Started back in England as an engineer. So I started out my career as a software engineer, mostly defense work, that kind of thing. And at that time, we were using case tools that were $10,000, computer-aided software engineering. I haven't heard that term for a long time. And they're on Unix workstations, so they're very expensive, very limited access. So I came up with the bright idea of doing one on a PC, and back in the days of DOS and so on. So we had to do everything from scratch. Fundamentally what it was about was understanding the business problem and building software to meet that need. So that's been a general theme, I would say, of my career for now 30 odd years.
So what was the first company that you built?
That was called Select. We ended up with, I think, about 40,000 users worldwide. Rational was a slightly better known competitor, but I took it through an IPO. It was an amazing journey. We learned so much about building a company, building a product, taking it to market. And one of the really satisfying aspects of that is that some of the people who worked for me then are now working for me again all these decades later. And I think part of that is that we just built a great culture for the company and just had a great time building it. We were all very young, and now we're a bit older, but doing it again.
And then after that, you started your next company.
So I moved to the US around that time, just after the IPO, and started Data Allegro, which was a data warehouse supply and spender. So I think in about 2006, 2007, we were running one of the biggest data warehouses in the world, maybe the biggest. It was 7 petabytes at that time, which was a lot pre-cloud, right? And 5 years in, we sold that to Microsoft. So that was another interesting learning curve. And worked for Microsoft for a couple of years as general manager of data warehousing globally. It's about $1 billion business unit within SQL Server. So that was fascinating too, to learn the limitations and benefits of wielding that big brand. And coming out of that, this was very much in the Hadoop era and everything. So a lot of talk of big data. So I decided, instead of jumping back in the saddle as CEO founder, I would come up with ideas and start companies. And it's what I guess you'd call a venture studio now. All big data platforms, AI solutions, some vertical, some horizontal. Started a whole bunch of companies there, and about half a dozen of them have survived and are thriving. So it was an interesting time.
So why start a new company?
So I think there's two fundamental things there. I think one was that I found it quite frustrating coming up with the idea and then handing it off to someone else. I think what I've realized through that period is that it's fun coming up with ideas, don't get me wrong, right? But actually selling the vision and creating a product to fulfill that vision and telling stories like we're doing now is actually where the fun is and where the real challenge is. So I decided a couple of years ago to get back in that saddle and do
tell us what is Geminos?
Yeah, so it really came out of not just my own personal need for better fulfillment, I guess, but also some of the key challenges that I'd seen in building all those companies and seeing customers really as early adopters of AI-driven solutions. And I think two fundamental things there. One is that there's a huge amount of demand for these kind of solutions. I think IDC put a number out that we're going to need 500 million new applications, AI-driven, in the next 5 years to build Industry 4.0. Well, great. There's probably 4 or 5 million people in the world that could do that, trained data scientists, and it takes 6 of them 18 months or so to build one. So do the math. You don't need to be a data scientist to figure out that we can't get there, right? So I think there's a major productivity problem. But But there's also a quality problem. And in researching this, how do we improve productivity? I came across the work of Professor Judith Hurwitz out of UCLA on causality. And what I'd seen over and over again is that we could build cool algorithms. We could look at the data for, let's say, an industrial problem in clean energy or whatever. But could we reuse it in multiple use cases? Would it stand the test of time? And the answer is generally, well, not necessarily, because it might just be based on a correlation in the data. It might not actually be causal. So that's really what I started to latch onto and start to understand a bit better. And the Book of Why is the kind of seminal work in that by Poe. So yeah, as a team, we decided to build a platform around that concept.
And this is a cloud-based platform, software as a service.
It is, yeah. And, in some ways, it's kind of the confluence of all the things I've done in my career, right? And Jerry Schumann, the CTO, et cetera. So we've struggled with these problems of, I'll just name a couple of fundamental ones, but, one is, does the business actually understand data science? Do the data scientists understand the business problem? Do they have any way to bridge that gap, that communication problem? Well, not really, right? It's something we struggled with for decades. And I think in many ways, causal modeling and the causal science that underpins it is a way to address that problem. I think also back in the day when I was doing case tools, as they used to be called, there was always this break point. You could do nice models, you could communicate that with the business, communicate that with the developers, but then you went off and wrote code. And the documentation sat on the shelf, right? It was just, again, within 6 months, no one ever looked at it again because it was out of date. So I think bridging that gap and having continuity all the way from the business problem to the actual running application. And, a big part of how we've built this platform is to use causal modeling and causal science to provide that continuity. So these causal models go all the way from, let's understand what's happening in the real world, let's understand what they cause us to do, and let's build a whole solution architected around that and underpinned by the math. And that for me is, it solves so many problems, right? As soon as you get that, and it brings in no code, low code, it brings in all cloud, Kubernetes, all of that comes together to make all that possible. And 20, 30 years ago when I tried this first time around, just didn't have that foundation. Now we do. So I think we're able to make a big impact on that kind of problem.
So some of the emerging companies in this field basically begin with data. They hire 100 data scientists, and everything is sort of a custom project. Geminos is taking a bit of a different approach. Could you sort of describe what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a fundamental point there that you kind of raised in that question, which is a lot of people in AI today, and the Lambda thing from Google is probably extreme of this. If we throw more data at it, it's going to come up with the right answer, maybe even become sentient, which is a little out there, let's say. And we're taking a pretty different approach to that. What we're saying is, let's actually understand the world. Let's think about the cause-effect chains that describe that world. And then let's look at the data that's actually relevant to that. And that's a really kind of fundamental part of the philosophy behind the platform. So start with some subject matter expertise, start to understand the world in that sense, and then look at the data. And sometimes you might start with data, don't get me wrong, it's iterative. Obviously we don't start from a complete green field in these situations. We usually have a pretty good understanding of the field and the data, but leverage that to really build a meaningful and useful causal model. Understand, hey, if this variable changes, this outcome is going to change by this much. Here are the paths between the two. Here are the things where correlations might cause problems like bias. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in this interview. How do we prevent those problems right from the get-go instead of hoping that they don't, hoping the algorithm figures it out for us? We can't, that's not working.
Yeah,
that's why we have so much bias and lack of focus in these algorithms.
So two of the big problems and big issues that people are talking about in the field of AI is bias, where somebody picks a data set first that they assume is the right one. And it often will include bias. And the other issue is explainability. So how does causality or causal AI address this through the Geminos Causeway platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really, I think, one of the key sets of benefits, right, that fall out of this. So if you think about bias, what it tends to be is a correlation that shouldn't have been included, and you need to condition on that, you need to block it. So if you do a causal model of this, you end up understanding those various paths, and the tool will actually analyze that for you. So it will actually say, here's a potential source of bias, here's a backdoor path, here are the variables that you could use to condition on that, to block it. And what it's doing is forcing you to intentionally consider those things and forcing you to intentionally block them right from day one, right? Just understanding the problem. You don't even have to have data at that point. You're just looking at the model structurally. So you understand the real causal path that's interesting to you. You understand the data that you really need to analyze in order to fulfill that front door path. And you know the variables that you need to block the backdoor paths that cause bias and lack of fairness, etc. So I think that is a massive benefit of this approach. And you get doing it right from the beginning. It also really helps you from a data quality point of view. You know, we hear over and over again, right, in building these systems, it's great, I could build the algorithm, but the data's messy and there's so much of it, and I've got to spend a year up front cleaning all the data up before I can run the algorithms. Well, great, but a lot of that data you don't really need because it's not actually causal, or it's, you know, something you can block off. So if you start from that point, then you've narrowed the problem down potentially really significantly before you even start looking at the data. So I think that's, again, just a massive benefit, right, of productivity. You know, we can actually avoid a lot of those issues. You know, and explainability is obviously the other one. You know, one of the big benefits here is that we're breaking the problem down into a series of cause-effect chains. Instead of having one big monolithic algorithm and then maybe at best trying to use, you know, SHAP analysis or whatever to look back into it to figure out what it thought was interesting. We're actually breaking it down and saying, here's the real world. What is actually interesting? What is actually driving the outcome? And let's build a series of algorithms to fulfill that. So instead of having a monolithic algorithm, we've actually broken it down. So it's a divide and conquer approach, immediate benefits on transparency, explainability, and as we've talked about, bias reduction. All of those things are massive problems today. And immediately we've reduced them, you know, order of magnitude maybe.
Another issue that I think is very important to Geminos is the use of open source and publicly available models and whatnot. So can you sort of describe that approach?
Yeah, that's a big question. I'll try to break it down a little bit. So, you know, we recognize that building a complete platform to do all the things I've just talked about from scratch would be an enormous task, right, to enterprise class standards as well. So we didn't bite that off. We decided to build it into an established open source foundation. There are two fundamental pieces. One is that we picked a platform called Node-RED, which spun out of IBM a few years ago. It's open source, very widely used, tens of thousands of users. And it's a low-code, very graphical development environment. Thousands of nodes, all the AI libraries you can imagine, AWS, TensorFlow, Microsoft, etc. Interfaces to pretty much every data source. And also UI, you can easily build your own web pages, you can push data to Excel or Power BI or whatever, really. So we've kind of inherited all of that. And what we've done is built causal models and static knowledge models, more traditional knowledge models, into that. So you can kind of go seamlessly from causal models and the underpinning data structures get the data in to hydrate it, and then drop immediately into, okay, here's the actual code I've got to create to produce this solution. And it's all any cloud, any platform, can be used in-house, behind the firewall, all the applications of microservices, Kubernetes, Docker, etc. So it's really given us a massive head start, to say the least. And then the other piece is the underlying kind of repository that we use. We've picked a knowledge graph database called TypeDB. It's by a British company, actually. A great platform for us. Users don't necessarily need to worry about it. It's just at one level, it's our repository in terms of the tool. But the neat thing is that, first of all, as a repository, it's queryable, right? So anybody can just write queries against that database. They can get the structures of the models. They can add in libraries. They can do their own integration if they want. And it's also the mechanism we use to integrate other things as well. So that's a very important aspect of it. The other thing is it's designed to be a knowledge layer for an enterprise. That's what they kind of built it for. So if customers want to, they could actually use it that way as well. We generate schemas for it, etc. And I just want to make a point there that a really key element of our approach on this is that, you know, I've got a background in knowledge engineering as well as part of my various paths to this point. And I view that as kind of static information that we need together, right? It's the entities, the relationships, the attributes, and you know, having a graph form behind it, not relational, is very powerful. Well, great. What causal modeling does is add the dynamics to that. We can build a causal model for each use case and show how it kind of cuts through that knowledge model, right? Which artifacts does it use, and what messages does it pass around, and so on. So it's that kind of combination of the static and dynamic views of knowledge, which I think becomes really, really powerful. And of course, before I forget, on the open source front, really important is that we're incorporating a lot of the libraries that have been created by people like Microsoft Research, Uber, etc. And we're building in those libraries into the platform. So we're not going out there and, you know, trying to create our own version of Perl's causal calculus in library form. We're taking the best of the best, incorporating those. We're going to, there's a new one from Google that we've come across that we're going to incorporate as well. Another one from McKinsey. So we're going to just build those in, but make them a lot more usable. So again, bring it into this no-code environment where you can hydrate it with data, you can run the libraries, you don't have to write any Python to do that, and you can start to really understand the causal structures of it. So the overall result of that is a very stable, very usable platform that business analysts can use. Yeah, you don't have to be a causal AI guy or a data scientist to do that. You know, people then can help assess those models and help refine them. And then the data scientists can use that as a framework, not just for their algorithms, but for the entire solution. And part of the vision going forwards as well is we're actually going to start monitoring the running application from a causal perspective. So it's not just modeling up front and helping you solve those problems and, you know, helping solve all the problems of bias, etc. It's also when you've actually created this newly digitalized version of your business and you're running it, what is actually happening? And are things happening more often than we thought? Are certain causal paths not as important as we expected, right? So I think this is a really important aspect of it going forward. And we haven't built that out full yet, but we've got the vision to take it there. So imagine this kind of holistic platform that goes from subject matter expertise, understand the real world, iterate through that, understand the data better, reduce bias and increase transparency as you're going, and then produce an actual application and then run it and, you know, really understand what's going on in your business. And if something's going wrong or changing, what do we do? Is it good? Is it bad? How do we intervene to make it better? So it's really this very broad vision, all underpinned by causal science. And I think that's just an enormous breakthrough. So really excited to say this forward.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And so in terms of next steps, if you would like to learn more about Geminos, we will provide you with a link to, so that you can get in touch with us, get a demo of the platform and engage with us. So we really appreciate your time today and look forward to more engagement. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Judith.
So it's been great speaking with you today. We want to keep this dialogue going. So we have set up a Slack channel. So if you have questions or you want to engage in a dialogue, we are very focused on setting up a community for engagement. So please get in touch with our Slack channel, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you very much and have a great day.